People are constantly moving in and out of metropolitan and suburban areas, but our ancestors buried at the Macedonia Cemetery will be here forever. We can learn a lot from the people who lived here, died here, and are buried here in the Macedonia Cemetery. Around the area where the Macedonia Cemetery is located, communities were established and inhabited by white settlers, enslaved African Americans, and indigenous people. Over time, more white settlers moved into Native American lands, including the now Johns Creek area.
Cherokee Native Americans, prior to European contact, were mostly here in the northern part or upper Piedmont area of the state of Georgia. But it also encompassed, the Carolinas, both north and south, and swooping around into Tennessee and also Alabama, this big, huge area geographically. They basically lived in kind of like, I guess what you would think of as like neighborhoods today, complete with neighborhood fence that surrounded all of the houses. So everybody in the neighborhood was like a little village, right? So every family would have their houses, and they usually had 2 houses a year. They would have a summer house and then a winter house. And they had, of course, regular village life, and in their neighborhood, they would have the fence that surrounded the homes and the family, and of course a center kind of court or area where they could meet, and then a longhouse usually. And that was like where the village would get together, and then the court was kind of like the size of a football or soccer field, and they could play games and stuff like that on there. Now outside the fence is where all of their crops were, and they would plant crops kind of all together, all surrounding. And of course you have, men would go out and go hunting and fishing and all of that stuff. That's pretty much how it was pre-contact.
Several notable Cherokee figures lived in present-day Johns Creek. George Morgan Waters was part Cherokee. He was educated in Britain and owned several hundred acres of plantation land near today's Macedonia Cemetery. Waters also held 120 enslaved African Americans. Improvements made to his land valued at $14,375.50, showing his extreme wealth. He freed about half of his enslaved African Americans in his will. Once the white settlers arrived, the Cherokees' long and tumultuous history in Georgia around the area of the Macedonia Cemetery was a crucial factor to consider in the development and history of the environment around the graveyard.
We get into the early 19th century, so early 1800s, where gold was discovered in Dahlonega, which is in the northern portion of our state. And once gold, you said that word, all of the Europeans said, well, we have to get all of those Native Americans out of here, and because we have to have that gold and we have to have that land. And so that's when you start getting into federal intervention, state intervention of removing the Native Americans, not just the Cherokee, but Cherokee, Creek, Muskogee, all of them, forcibly removing them.
White settlers moved to North Georgia in hopes of becoming rich beyond belief through the gold and owning hundreds of acres of land. According to Ms. Cobb, many white settlers were interested in trading with the Cherokee before forced eviction. White trappers and traders established small frontier shops like stores, restaurants, and newspaper trading posts between settlements and villages.
Diverse groups interacted along just fine, depending on where you were. If you were a white settler or a frontiersman moving here to the north part of Georgia, interacting with Native Americans, usually they got along just fine. If it's a one white person versus a large group of Native Americans, the white person is going to get along just fine. They're probably even going to maybe even intermarry, have families together, or maybe even move into that village, that Native American village. Now, when the U.S. military came here and forced those Cherokees to move and go on the Trail of Tears, several of those, or a lot, a good portion of them, of enslaved people moved along with the Cherokee people and resettled in what is now what we know as Oklahoma.
Presidents of Johns Creek, such as John Rogers and his 2 oldest sons, who were part Native Americans, advocated for the rights of the Cherokee as more white settlers moved into North Georgia and desired land and resources. The Cherokee filed a lawsuit challenging the Indian Removal Act. In the Supreme Court case Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, the court ruled that the Cherokee lived in their nation and could not leave Georgia. However, the state of Georgia and Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling and continued with the forced Cherokee removal. As a result, the Cherokee Nation challenged and resisted forced removal from their lands. For example, John Rogers, a wealthy resident of present-day Johns Creek and head of a Cherokee family. He was notably friends with Andrew Jackson and married Sarah Condrey. He had 9 sons and 3 daughters with his wife. He built a house on the Chattahoochee River, which he refused to leave even when the white settlers attempted to force his family out. Despite the challenges to forced removal, members of the Cherokee Nation, including family members of Major Ridge and John Rowland Ridge, signed a removal agreement with the United States government at New Echota in 1835 against the wishes of most Cherokee. This New Echota Treaty was a subject of contention among the Cherokee. It required the Cherokee to exchange their lands for a parcel in the Indian Territory in Oklahoma and relocate within 2 years. This treaty was motivated by the greed of federal government and white settlers who coveted Cherokee lands. After it was signed, Chief John Ross, a prominent chief who helped write the Cherokee Constitution, gathered over 1,000 Cherokee signatures against the treaty. This provided that the majority of the tribe was not in agreement. Eventually, the Cherokee were forcibly removed by the U.S. Army and sent on the Trail of Tears, where 4,000 to 5,000 people died. Before the white settlement of the United States, slavery was practiced in some Native American societies, including the Cherokee. Enslaved Native Americans became common currency between Native nations throughout the Americas, often traded for ammunition, tools, and food. According to a 2017 Time magazine article, Indian slavery never went away, but rather coexisted with African slavery from the 16th century throughout the 19th century. Slavery across parts of Cherokee society, specifically in Georgia, was a strategy to build a complex political alliance. When European colonists arrived, they brought a system of slavery based on forced labor and profit. As a result, some Native American societies enslaved African Americans to work on plantations. In 1838, the Georgia militia expelled Cherokees from their homeland. Known as the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee Nation's removal enforced federal law, passed to respond to the rapid expansion of white settlers across Georgia and the Southeast. Families were taken out of their cabins and forced to leave most of their possessions behind. Throughout this exodus, Cherokee and enslaved African American lives were lost to disease, malnourishment, and mistreatment throughout the perilous journey from North Georgia to present-day Oklahoma. In addition to the hardships of the trip, enslaved blacks were forced to leave along with the Cherokee. As a result, much of the diversity seen in the area around the Macedonia Cemetery is partly because African Americans and Cherokee themselves were forced into enslavement.
History is all about what happened, right? Who lived in the past? What decisions did they make? And how did that affect who we are today? And if we don't learn from that, how are we going to make things better?
With the events that took place, we will become more involved in studying our past and have a greater overall appreciation for the land we inhabit.